Economics is just about numbers and charts, the professor asked, his voice echoing slightly in the large, sunlit classroom. The students shifted in their seats, some nodding, others clearly unsure where the question was leading. The professor smiled, sensing their hesitation. Many people do, he continued, but today, I want to show you something different, something deeper. Imagine a world where economics isn't just about profit, but about compassion. Where our decisions are driven by the well-being of every person, especially the poorest, and where the health of our planet is just as important as the balance sheets of corporations. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Today, we're going to explore the work of Jeffrey Sachs, an economist who believes that solving the world's biggest problems, poverty, inequality, climate change, requires more than just technical solutions. It requires ethical principles, spiritual wisdom, and a profound sense of interconnectedness. Sachs' ideas are bold, revolutionary even, and they challenge us to rethink everything we thought we knew about economics. The students leaned forward, intrigued, ready to dive into a new way of thinking about the world. Jeffrey Sachs, a figure known for his groundbreaking work in economics, stands out in a world that is often defined by data, profit margins, and growth statistics. His approach to economics isn't just about numbers or abstract theories, but rather a holistic framework that seeks to integrate ethical, spiritual, and moral values into the very fabric of global development. Sachs brings a refreshingly human perspective into the often cold world of economics, making his work resonate deeply with those who believe in a future that includes compassion, empathy, and responsibility. This video will delve deeply into Sachs' approach to economic development, his admiration for Buddhist principles, his critique of traditional economic systems, and his vision for a sustainable future. By exploring these facets of Sachs' thought, we will aim to not only understand the man himself but also engage in the broader implications of bringing ethical and spiritual principles into the conversation about solving global issues. This exploration will challenge us to ask, what could our world look like if compassion and mindfulness were as central to policymaking as financial or technical considerations? How would our global economy function if we truly believed in the interconnectedness of all beings, as Buddhism teaches? And perhaps most crucially, what role should ethics play in shaping the future of humanity? Who is Jeffrey Sachs? A life dedicated to change. To truly understand the depth of Jeffrey Sachs' contributions, it's essential to look at the man behind the ideas. Born in Detroit, Michigan, in 1954, Sachs grew up in a time of political and social upheaval in the United States. As a young student, he was not just interested in economics from a technical standpoint but was deeply moved by the social and political contexts that defined the 1960s and 1970s. He saw firsthand the economic disparities that plagued many parts of America and became interested in how economics could be used not merely as a tool for understanding markets but as a vehicle for social change. This sense of social responsibility led Sachs to pursue a career in economics. But not in the traditional sense. While many of his peers gravitated toward roles in corporate finance or academia, Sachs chose a different path. He earned his PhD from Harvard University and, at the young age of 29, became one of the youngest economics professors in the institution's history. However, his ambitions were never confined to academic theory. Sachs wanted to use his expertise to address real-world issues, and that meant stepping outside the ivory tower of academia. One of his earliest high-profile roles was advising Bolivia in the 1980s during its hyperinflation crisis. At the time, Bolivia was experiencing an economic catastrophe that threatened to plunge the country into complete collapse. Sachs, applying his knowledge of macroeconomics, was instrumental in crafting policies that stabilized the nation's economy. His work in Bolivia earned him global recognition, but even more importantly, it ignited his passion for helping struggling nations. From Bolivia, Sachs moved on to a wide range of international projects. His work took him to Eastern Europe, where he advised countries transitioning from communism to capitalism following the collapse of the Soviet Union. He also began working closely with the United Nations, particularly on global issues related to poverty, climate change, and sustainable development. Over time, Sachs became a trusted advisor to leaders around the world, including Kofi Annan and Ban Ki-moon, both of whom served as Secretaries General of the UN. His influence on the Millennium Development Goals, MDGs, which sought to address some of the most pressing challenges facing humanity, including extreme poverty, hunger, and inequality, was profound. But Sachs is not simply an expert in crisis management. What truly distinguishes him is his holistic, morally grounded approach to global development. He challenges the status quo in economics, which often prioritizes growth and profit above all else, and advocates for an approach that takes into account the well-being of all people, especially the poorest, and the health of the planet. It is this bold vision that has earned him both admiration and criticism throughout his career. 2. Sachs' revolutionary economic vision. The role of ethics. The conventional approach to economics often revolves around efficiency, profits, and maximizing utility. The standard models treat humans as rational agents who make decisions based on self-interest. In this paradigm, the primary goal is to increase GDP or maximize returns for investors. However, Jeffrey Sachs has long argued that such a narrow view of economics is not only incomplete but deeply flawed. For Sachs, economic decisions cannot be isolated from their broader social, environmental, and ethical contexts. He asserts that human well-being, not economic growth alone, should be the central measure of a successful economy. What does this mean in practical terms? How can one inject morality into economic policies that, traditionally, focus on profits and growth? Sachs believes that the answer lies in rethinking the fundamental goals of economic policy. Rather than viewing economics as a value-neutral science, he insists that ethical considerations must guide decision-making at every level. His argument is simple yet profound: economics should serve humanity, not the other way around. This perspective challenges the widely accepted notion that economics and ethics operate in separate spheres. In fact, Sachs sees the two as inseparable. When policymakers focus solely on economic indicators like GDP, they ignore crucial issues such as inequality, environmental degradation, and human suffering. To better understand Sachs' revolutionary vision, let's take a deeper look at how he believes ethical principles should be integrated into economics. Human-centered development. At the heart of Sachs' philosophy is the belief that economic growth must be human-centered. He frequently speaks about the quality of life as the ultimate measure of success, rather than abstract numbers like GDP. But what does human-centered really mean? For Sachs, it means that development policies should focus on eliminating poverty, promoting equality, and improving access to essential services such as healthcare, education, and clean water. He argues that any economic system that leaves behind the poorest and most vulnerable is fundamentally flawed. Moreover, Sachs places great emphasis on eradicating extreme poverty, a goal that has been central to much of his career. He often highlights the fact that the world has more than enough resources to lift every person out of poverty, yet inequality persists. This, in his view, is not just an economic problem but a moral failing. Sachs believes that wealthier nations and individuals have a moral obligation to help those who are struggling. He sees poverty not just as a lack of material wealth but as a denial of dignity and human rights. His passion for poverty alleviation is perhaps most evident in his work on the Millennium Development Goals. Sachs played a pivotal role in crafting the MDGs, which set out a blueprint for tackling some of the world's most pressing challenges, from hunger to child mortality. The success of the MDGs was not just about hitting specific targets but about shifting the global conversation around development. Sachs helped move the focus away from economic growth as an end in itself, instead advocating for policies that improve human well-being, environmental sustainability, and ethical stewardship. Sachs has also been an outspoken advocate for environmental sustainability, a cause he ties closely to his ethical framework. For Sachs, protecting the planet is not just a matter of prudent policy, it's a moral imperative. He argues that future generations have a right to a healthy planet. And we have a responsibility to ensure that the resources we consume today do not jeopardize their future. One of Sachs' central arguments is that the current economic model, which prioritizes short-term profits and resource extraction, is unsustainable. He is a fierce critic of policies that contribute to climate change, deforestation, and pollution, all of which disproportionately affect poor communities and exacerbate inequality. Sachs believes that failing to address environmental degradation is not only economically irresponsible but also ethically unjustifiable. In his book The Age of Sustainable Development, Sachs outlines a path forward that emphasizes the need for a green economy. He calls for policies that promote renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, and conservation. But for Sachs, sustainability is not just a policy choice, it's a moral obligation to future generations. He frequently invokes the concept of stewardship, arguing that we are merely caretakers of the planet and must act responsibly to ensure its survival for those who come after us. Global cooperation and shared responsibility. Sachs' vision for economic development extends far beyond national borders. He is a passionate advocate for global cooperation, particularly when it comes to addressing challenges like climate change, disease, and poverty. For Sachs, the interconnectedness of the world means that no country can solve these problems alone. Instead, he calls for a spirit of solidarity and shared responsibility. This idea is particularly evident in Sachs' work with the United Nations. He has frequently argued that wealthy nations have a moral duty to assist poorer countries in their development efforts. This is not just a matter of charity but of global justice. Sachs points out that many of the world's poorest countries are suffering the consequences of climate change and economic exploitation, despite contributing little to these problems. For him, global development must be a collective effort, grounded in empathy and a recognition of our shared humanity. One of the most powerful examples of Sachs' commitment to global cooperation is his involvement in the Paris Agreement on climate change. Sachs was a vocal advocate for the agreement, which aims to limit global temperature rise and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. He has often spoken about the importance of wealthy nations taking the lead in reducing emissions, given their historical role in contributing to the climate crisis. For Sachs, the Paris Agreement isn't just a set of policies, it represents a moral commitment by the global community to safeguard the planet for future generations. He has repeatedly emphasized that wealthy nations, which have historically benefited the most from industrialization and contributed the most to greenhouse gas emissions, have a greater ethical responsibility to lead in reducing their environmental impact. Sachs argues that this responsibility extends beyond simply reducing emissions within their own borders. Wealthy countries, he believes, must also assist poorer nations that are disproportionately affected by climate change, despite contributing very little to the problem. He advocates for the transfer of technology and financial resources to developing countries so they can adapt to the consequences of climate change and pursue sustainable development without repeating the mistakes of the past. Sachs has been particularly vocal about the climate injustice that exists between the global north and the global south. The countries most affected by rising temperatures, extreme weather, and sea level rise are often those least equipped to deal with the consequences. In his view, this stark imbalance makes it imperative for wealthier nations to not only take aggressive action to reduce their own emissions but to help vulnerable nations mitigate and adapt to the devastating effects of climate change. Failure to do so, Sachs argues, would be a moral failing of historic proportions. He has also been a strong proponent of setting binding international targets and holding countries accountable for their commitments under the Paris Agreement. Sachs believes that voluntary measures are insufficient to address the scale of the climate crisis, and he advocates for mechanisms that can enforce compliance with emissions reduction targets. In his view, the climate crisis is so urgent that the global community cannot afford half measures or broken promises. Sachs' advocacy for climate action is deeply rooted in his broader ethical vision for the world. For him, climate change is not just an environmental issue, it's a humanitarian and ethical crisis. The choices that countries make today will determine the fate of millions, particularly those living in poverty and in regions most vulnerable to the changing climate. Sachs' involvement in the Paris Agreement reflects his belief that global cooperation, grounded in compassion, fairness, and shared responsibility, is essential for solving the world's most pressing problems. The intersection of Buddhism and Sachs' ethical vision. One of the most fascinating aspects of Sachs' philosophy is the influence of Buddhism on his thinking, particularly its focus on compassion, interconnectedness, and mindfulness. While Sachs is not a practicing Buddhist, he has frequently drawn upon Buddhist principles to articulate his vision for a more ethical and sustainable world. At the core of Buddhism is the concept of dukkha, or suffering, and the idea that alleviating suffering should be a central goal of human life. Sachs, too, is deeply concerned with alleviating human suffering, particularly in the form of extreme poverty and inequality. He often speaks about the moral obligation that wealthier individuals and nations have to help those who are suffering, drawing parallels to the Buddhist ideal of compassion. In Buddhism, compassion is not just a feeling, it is an active force that compels individuals to take action to relieve the suffering of others. Sachs echoes this sentiment in his advocacy for policies that prioritize the well-being of the world's poorest. He believes that global development should be rooted in empathy, and that governments and international organizations must work together to create a more just and equitable world. Sachs' emphasis on compassionate action aligns closely with Buddhist teachings, which emphasize that true compassion must lead to real, tangible changes in the world. Another important Buddhist concept that resonates with Sachs is interconnectedness. In Buddhism, this idea refers to the understanding that all beings and phenomena are deeply interconnected, and that the actions of one person or nation can have profound effects on others. Sachs applies this concept to global development, arguing that no nation can stand alone in the face of challenges like climate change, global health crises, and economic inequality. For Sachs, the recognition of our shared humanity and our mutual dependence is essential for creating a world that works for everyone. This idea of interconnectedness also informs Sachs' advocacy for global cooperation. He believes that the world's most pressing challenges, whether they are environmental, economic, or social, cannot be solved by individual nations acting in isolation. Instead, Sachs calls for a new era of global solidarity, in which countries work together to address common challenges and share the benefits of development. He frequently invokes the idea that the well-being of one nation is tied to the well-being of all nations, and that only by recognizing this can we create a more sustainable and just world. Sachs also draws upon the Buddhist concept of mindfulness in his work, particularly when it comes to policymaking. Mindfulness, in the Buddhist tradition, refers to the practice of being fully present and aware of one's actions and their consequences. Sachs argues that global leaders need to adopt a more mindful approach to decision-making, particularly in areas like environmental policy, where the consequences of inaction can be catastrophic. He calls for leaders to be fully conscious of the long-term impacts of their decisions, not just on their own countries, but on the entire world and future generations. In many ways, Sachs' integration of Buddhist principles into his work reflects his broader belief that ethical values must play a central role in solving global challenges. He argues that technical solutions alone are not enough, that real progress requires a moral and spiritual awakening. For Sachs, the lessons of Buddhism offer powerful guidance for how to create a more compassionate, interconnected, and sustainable world. Criticism and challenges of Sachs' approach. Despite the elegance and moral force of Sachs' arguments, his approach has not been without its critics. Some have argued that Sachs' focus on ethical principles and global cooperation can be overly idealistic, particularly in a world where national interests and political realities often dominate the decision-making process. Critics argue that while it's easy to advocate for compassion and interconnectedness, implementing policies that reflect these values can be far more difficult, especially in an international system that is frequently defined by competition and self-interest. One of the main critiques of Sachs' approach is that it may underestimate the challenges posed by global power dynamics. In a world where powerful nations often prioritize their own economic interests, convincing these countries to make sacrifices for the greater global good can be a difficult, if not impossible, task. Sachs calls for wealthy nations to take on a greater share of the responsibility for solving global problems, such as climate change and poverty, are frequently met with resistance, particularly from countries that feel they should not be penalized for their success. Some critics also argue that Sachs' reliance on global cooperation may overlook the complexities of international relations. In practice, global cooperation is often hindered by political differences, economic rivalries, and cultural barriers. While Sachs paints a compelling picture of a world united by a shared sense of responsibility, critics question whether such unity is realistic in a world where nations frequently act out of self-interest. Additionally, Sachs' involvement in projects like the Millennium Villages Project has faced scrutiny. While the initiative aimed to lift rural African communities out of poverty through a comprehensive, multi-sectoral approach, some evaluations have questioned the long-term sustainability of the project's outcomes. Critics argue that Sachs' ambitious goals, while well-intentioned, may have overestimated the ability of external interventions to create lasting change in deeply impoverished regions. Finally, some economists and policymakers argue that Sachs' emphasis on moral and spiritual values in economics can make policy formulation more subjective and difficult to implement. They contend that economics, as a discipline, should remain focused on data-driven, empirical approaches, and that introducing ethical considerations risks making the field too normative, potentially clouding objective analysis. Sachs' response: the urgency of ethical economics. In response to these critiques, Sachs maintains that ethical considerations are not only necessary but urgent. He argues that the very crises we face today, climate change, global inequality, and the fragility of international relations, are the result of an economic system that has neglected moral values for too long. For Sachs, the failures of traditional economics to address these challenges only underscore the need for a new approach, one that is grounded in compassion, fairness, and a recognition of our shared humanity. Sachs is fully aware of the political and economic obstacles to global cooperation, but he believes that these challenges only highlight the importance of ethical leadership. In his view, it is precisely because the world is so divided, and because self-interest so often prevails over collective well-being, that we must push for a moral awakening in the way we approach global development. Sachs argues that continuing with business as usual will only deepen the crises we face, and that a new, ethically grounded framework is essential for long-term survival. Moreover, Sachs does not see his approach as idealistic, but rather as pragmatic in the face of the real dangers posed by inaction. He frequently points to the existential threat of climate change as an example of how failure to adopt a more ethical, cooperative approach could lead to disaster. Sachs believes that the cost of inaction far outweighs the challenges of implementing his vision, and he continues to advocate for policies that prioritize human and environmental well-being over short-term gains. In terms of the practical challenges of implementing ethical policies, Sachs acknowledges that it will not be easy. However, he argues that the success of initiatives like the Millennium Development Goals and international agreements on climate change demonstrate that global cooperation, while difficult, is achievable. He points to the progress made in reducing extreme poverty and improving global health outcomes as evidence that when nations come together with a shared sense of purpose, real change is possible. Ultimately, Sachs believes that the future of global development depends on our willingness to embrace ethical responsibility. He argues that the world cannot afford to continue on its current path, and that a new vision, rooted in compassion and cooperation, is essential for creating a more just, sustainable, and equitable world. As the lecture drew to a close, the professor looked around the room, seeing the thoughtful expressions on his students' faces. He could tell they had been deeply affected by what they had learned about Jeffrey Sachs and his vision for a more compassionate, ethically grounded approach to economics. So, the professor said, his voice softer now, we've come full circle. Remember the question I asked you at the start of today's lesson? Economics, is it really just numbers and charts? After learning about Sachs, I hope you see that it's much more than that. It's about people. It's about compassion. It's about making decisions that not only grow economies but uplift humanity. Sachs challenges us to ask, how do our policies affect the poorest among us? What is our responsibility to the planet? And can we build a world where mindfulness, interconnectedness, and ethics guide our choices? He paused for a moment, allowing the room to fill with a quiet sense of reflection. Sachs may not have all the answers, the professor continued, but what he offers is a powerful reminder that economics, like everything else, is about choices, and those choices can either harm or heal. It's up to us to decide which path we take. What kind of world will you help create? The students sat in silence, contemplating their roles in the future, the professor's words echoing in their minds as they packed up their things. They knew they had been given more than just a lesson in economics that day, they had been given a new way of seeing the world. And that, they realized, was a lesson that would stay with them far beyond the classroom.